Just before we continue with today's episode, I do want to say a big thank you to the fantastic people over at Vessies who... a bit of mud coming off the bottom of my shoe, but that proves just how much I wear these bad boys. I wear Vessies pretty much all year. Their advertising is always focused around Dymatex, which is the material they're made out of, and it keeps your feet completely dry inside. Your socks will remain dry because this isn't a water-resistant shoe, it's a waterproof shoe. But my point is, it's summer right now, and I'm still wearing Vessies. I walked into the office in these this morning. And I'm like, yeah, your feet don't sweat despite them being waterproof. They're, substantially well used. I have many pairs. I got a brand new pair right over there. I got a lot of Vessies. These are just kind of a go-to, super comfortable. They're well formed to my feet pair. And when I eventually wear these out, which I mean, a couple of years, I guess. How long do shoes last for when you wear them every day? I'll just get exactly the same pair again, because that's how much I like them. Look, whatever you're up to, grab a pair of Vessies. They're the best shoes you'll ever get. Just go to vessi.com/shadows. You'll get 15% off your first order. It's backed up by a 1-year warranty and a 30-day hassle-free return. Thanks to Vessi for sponsoring. And now today's video. This magazine teaches people how to build bombs in their homes. It gives explicit instructions on how to bypass airport security, derail trains, and assassinate political leaders with step-by-step guides. The hope being that those who have been poisoned by dogma carry out the most brutal kind of attacks on innocent people in the name of their god. And it doesn't come from some tiny sect in the middle of nowhere that nobody's ever heard of. It is written, produced, and published by the very people responsible for the most infamous terrorist attack of all time. So, how can we unpack this radical jihadist handbook of hate? Well, to understand what it says and to analyze its impact, we have to delve into the toxic ideology of one of the world's most premier terror networks. And in doing so, we can answer the question, has this magazine ever been a genuine threat to Western civilization, or is it just another propaganda publication senselessly stoking fear? So, what actually is Inspire, and where did it come from? Well, put simply, it's an English-language magazine and media property that is published and released by the fundamental Islamic terrorist group Al-Qaeda, specifically Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, also known as AQAB, or just AQ for short. But let's set the stage for a second. Imagine we're back in 2010, and Al-Qaeda, they're still the dangerous, impactful, and potent radical organization that they've been for over a decade at this point. Of their various regional arms, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, based in Yemen, probably the strongest. By this time, drone strikes have taken out a lot of the main organization based in Afghanistan and Pakistan and their central command. Osama bin Laden is hiding underground in Abbottabad, Pakistan, where SEAL Team 6 would make him a martyr the following year. And this opened the door for AQ to grow in influence. And, well, that is exactly what they did. On Christmas Day 2009, Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalab, a Nigerian national recruited by AQ, was badly burned on a US-bound flight from Amsterdam to Detroit after a bomb sewn into his underwear failed to detonate properly. 300 people were on the plane, and it was sheer luck that it didn't end in disaster. A year later, in 2010, AQ had snuck explosives into a cargo jet sat in London via the mail, with the explosives being in printer ink cartridges, along with the printer. Again, this was ultimately foiled, but AQ were the ones most aggressively going out and trying to attack the West at that time. Now, obviously, this is a bit of an oversimplification of a very complex global terror organization, and we could elaborate on them all day, but it does get across the general idea that AQ were setting the tone globally at this point, as far as radical jihad is concerned anyway. The Taliban and the Houthis didn't have a similar international presence, and ISIS wouldn't emerge as a global player for a few years yet. So, in 2010, AQ kind of stood alone. And it's amongst this caliphate-inducing, trend-setting time in 2010 that AQ started to get a bit more coordinated in their approach. And, well, they started producing their own media. Now again, this is certainly nothing new for Al-Qaeda, who have been in the terrorist propaganda game since the 1990s. You only have to Google for 5 seconds to find the Osama bin Laden tapes online. Don't do that, by the way, you'll get put on a list. But they were also in the business of movies and early exploitation of the internet through things like web forums. Even magazines and physical print media were not uncommon, but these were, for the most part, in Arabic. They were meant for smaller local sects of fighters and were more ideologically driven, almost a bit like a sermon. But AQ, they were going to put a few different elements together to create something new. They were going to start a magazine in English aimed at radical Muslims in the Western world to get them to act on the group's behalf. And to do this, they needed something that would be more palatable for Western audiences. And that's where two men specifically come into play, and you likely haven't even heard of them. Their names were Samir Khan and Anwar al-Awlaki. And the thing about these two men is that they had something that really set them apart from other Al-Qaeda members. They were American. Let's start with Khan, who was born in Saudi Arabia but grew up in New York and South Carolina. He was a US citizen that left the US for Yemen in 2009, and it was a blogger who distributed terrorist propaganda material from within the US several years prior. As for al-Awlaki, he was a US-born Islamic cleric who also lived in Yemen at the time and spent a lot of effort disseminating radical jihadist propaganda to anyone who would listen. And with Al-Qaeda's relative global decline by 2010 compared to its peak, as well as the massive step up in international security making attacks harder and harder to carry out, these two traitors had a bit of an idea. They were both radicalized while on US soil, and if it could happen to them, then it could happen to other Muslims within Western countries that were sympathetic to the cause. But they could go one further, not just getting these sympathizers to leave the country and join Al-Qaeda like they did, but to attack the West from within as individual, homegrown terror cells. They just needed to be shown what to do. And the best way to do that, they decided, was with a magazine. So they started one, but it had a bit of a twist. It would have all the sheen and flair of Western publications like Vogue or Time, and it would be written in perfectly fluent English for anyone in the Anglosphere to read. It was a sort of national jihadographic, if you will. And it wouldn't just talk about death to the West, it would show people how to bring it about. Again, these individual elements were likely nothing new. Jihadist magazines existed, jihadist propaganda in English existed, jihadist instructions on committing terror attacks existed, and even jihadist propaganda tailored for more Western audiences existed. But these guys, they brought it all together. And what did they call it? Inspire. Because that's what they were trying to do. They were trying to inspire the next generation of homegrown terrorists. The magazine's got a pretty long history at this point, too. It was first published, as we said, back in 2010, July to be exact, but new issues have been released as recently as 2024. Khan was the principal author to begin with, whilst al-Awlaki helped bring the clout with his name as a well-known American jihadist defector and senior ideologue within Al-Qaeda. Al-Awlaki's role in the publication of the magazine's not super clear even to this day, but we can assume he was an ideological contributor as well as the figurehead of the publication. We don't know whose idea Inspire ultimately was, with the likelihood being that it was the brainchild of both men considering their similar backgrounds and experiences. The other reason we know that al-Awlaki was likely heavily involved somehow, even if it wasn't concrete, was due to the ways in which both met their ends. Both Khan and al-Awlaki were killed in the same US drone strike on September 30th, 2011. This pretty much confirms the men were working together, and the assumption is that one of the things they worked together on was Inspire magazine. They were pretty busy in the time before Uncle Sam showed them why they didn't have free healthcare back stateside. Between the first issue in July 2010 and the men's deaths in September 2011, they were able to produce 7 issues of the magazine in a mere 14 months. So, for over a year, you had this publication coming out on average every 2 months or so. But what was in it? What had governments of the world tugging at their collars so much that those who started it would be targeted and killed? Must have been pretty bad, right? And well, yeah, you got no idea. Okay, so to recognize why the content in Inspire was so spooky to Western governments, we also need to know a little bit about Al-Qaeda, the group, and its ideology. Because so much of what terror groups like Al-Qaeda believe gets boiled down to, they hate our freedoms and stuff like that. And whilst that is sort of true, it's also a massive oversimplification. Because when you understand what it is that Al-Qaeda is trying to achieve globally, you can understand what drove them to produce the content in Inspire that they did. So, a quick lesson in Al-Qaeda's ideology. Al-Qaeda's goal, at least back during this time in the 2000s and early 2010s, was to bring about a caliphate, which you could think of like an Islamic empire or a dedicated state, where Islam is strictly enforced through Sharia law, no exceptions. ISIS, who started off as an offshoot group of Al-Qaeda, ended up somewhat succeeding at doing just that in large swaths of Iraq and Syria in the 2010s, but the general goal is to make that caliphate as geographically wide as possible and include places like Israel and other holy lands. It could even extend to the whole world. Al-Qaeda has a bone to pick with the West for this reason. The West's constant meddling in the Middle East throughout the 90s and early 2000s through things like the Gulf War and the Iraq War had Western soldiers in Muslim lands, in Muslim homes, actively combating the spread of such goals, as well as killing a lot of innocent Muslims as well. Groups like Al-Qaeda saw it as an affront to Allah that the US had troops stationed in Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War, for example, the holiest country in the Islamic world. This is what caused bin Laden to ultimately issue a fatwa, which is like an edict based on Sharia law, declaring jihad a holy war against the Americans and their allies. This culminated, of course, on September the 11th, 2001. That is to say, as far as Al-Qaeda is concerned, by 2010, the US and its associated Western allies were stopping them from both achieving their main goal and actively disrespecting what they saw as the ultimate word of Allah. The Western governments were to blame, but also Western culture and the Western people that drive both of those things. What this translates to, in broad terms, is that any Western targets were seen as permissible under Al-Qaeda's strict interpretation of radical Islam for attack. The West's decline and the US's defeat were express goals for Al-Qaeda to bring about their caliphate, and if attacking Western civilians was the way to do it, then so be it. And this, combined with those limitations that we mentioned earlier about national security tightening up, is what led to the creation of Inspire to try and bring about that decline from the inside. You can see this ideology bleed through into Inspire's content. In just the second issue ever, released in October of 2010, Sami Khan wrote in it critiques of the US government and its allies for their military incursions overseas. He said he was proud to be a traitor to America and that the US needed to be defeated to implant Islam all over the world. To do so, Khan was under no illusions that AQ's pursuits of those goals were violent, and we'll quote him here, "I am acutely aware that body parts have to be torn apart, skulls have to be crushed, and blood has to be spilled." End quote. Or let's look at the 7th issue, published just days before both Khan and al-Awlaki would be killed by the US government. The issue is dedicated to the 10-year anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. In this specific issue, Khan underscored the importance of media and ideology in bringing about global jihad, noting that you cannot kill an idea, quoting, "The credible ideas that we bring is what intimidates them, the West, the most." So, you can see the ideology woven into the very purpose of the publication in a way that is frighteningly coherent. Publishing this magazine towards sympathetic Muslims in the West would, in Al-Qaeda's view, bring about more attacks on Western soil, which would gradually bring about a global jihad, which would bring about the fall of the West and the rise of radical Islamic caliphate. We're not saying that such radical ideas are logical, far from it, but you can see their twisted interpretation of the series of events that could result from Inspire's publication, among other strategies. So, what content was inside Inspire then? What ultimately could they write down that was going to bring about this global jihadist revolution? Well, for starters, as we mentioned, Inspire wasn't just going to ideologically pontificate about its goals. It was designed to inspire people in the West to attack Western targets from within and actively carry out the pursuit of these goals. In short, the magazines taught people how to commit terrorist attacks. From the literal ingredients and steps someone could take to manufacture a bomb in their own kitchen, to how much it might all cost. Look at the printer ink example. That happened in late 2010. Inspire was already a thing. One of the editions literally covered the attempted attack across 23 pages and what a person could do to succeed at such a plot in horrifying detail, including airport security measures they believed they had overcome, as well as the technical specifications required for the device. One excerpt from an early issue reads, quoting here, "In 1 or 2 days, the bomb could be ready to kill at least 10 people. And those are powerful words for anyone who is quick to radicalize. People who wanted to find such information always would through some means, but Inspire offered a step-by-step guide all wrapped up in an ideologically anti-Western dogma. So it's easy to see why people were spooked. As the years rolled on, this became more elaborate, from the first issues with an article titled How to Build a Bomb in the Kitchen of Your Mum, to even more extreme how-to guides. It wrote about how to attack US planes, car bomb attacks, suicide bombings, assassinations, train derailment, and building devices that can bypass airport security. Lone wolf attacks were specifically encouraged because they're so hard for a government's domestic intelligence apparatus to track down before harm is caused. The magazine writes on such attacks, quote, "Praises to the Knights of Lone Jihad. You are lethal. You are devastating." Would-be lone wolves were advised to engage in attacks on roads by causing traffic accidents and torching parked vehicles. It taught them about assassinating political leaders and former political leaders because they may be less protected. It mentioned specific targets by name in the US, the UK, and France, even calling for the targeting of diplomats of these countries as well. But it's not all just how to be a terrorist, with other issues or articles focused on specific attacks and events related to Al-Qaeda over the years, such as the previously alluded to 9/11 special in September of 2011. That issue specifically justified the attacks as, quote, fair payback for the pain, suffering, and agony that America has brought to millions of Muslims around the world. There are other issues that celebrated the Boston Marathon bombing, the death of Osama bin Laden, and the 2015 Charlie Hebdo shooting in Paris, amongst others. On top of that, there were articles that were more ideological in nature as well, such as Khan's musing on the nature of the movement, or al-Awlaki's own theological sermons on various topics and strategies to push jihad spree. There were recruitment pamphlets, advice on how to contact the organization, contributions from readers of the magazine, and even collections of statements from senior radical jihadists like the big man himself, Osama bin Laden. Now, we're not suggesting that they somehow sat down with the terrorist-in-chief to get some original material, and AQ being based in Yemen with OBL in Pakistan at the time makes that even less likely. However, having his words, even if old, translated into English for Inspire's reader base, we can still imagine would have been quite the draw. It's not exactly cosmopolitan, but for any radical Western-born jihadist, it's just as well produced as anything you'd see in a newspaper stand. Okay, so that's all well and good. We know what was in it and why it was created, but there are some questions that arise from all of this. Did it work? Did it really lead to more lone wolf-style attacks in the Western world? And did it advance Al-Qaeda's actual goals of global jihad? Well, let's break it down, shall we? First of all, let's ask whether it was a smart idea. And that depends. Openly giving out the information you know on how to build explosive devices and essentially handing over a large swath of your tactics to Western intelligence might not be considered overly wise for operational security purposes. It tells the West what to expect from Al-Qaeda's lone wolf attacks, what patterns of behavior to look for, who have copies of the magazine, and it also opens up the potential for counterintelligence and sabotage. Let's use an example from a real event that happened when Inspire was first produced. The first issue was supposed to be a 67-page romp full of the best articles about the top 10 ways to radicalize your man or something. It included the instructions on how a person would make a bomb in their own kitchen from readily available materials. But when it initially came out originally, only 4 pages were released for some reason, and the 4th page was seemingly total gibberish. So, what happened? Well, it's disputed. Some say that there was some kind of Trojan horse virus implanted by Western counterintelligence to scupper plans or track who tried to download it. Although not everyone is sure there ever was a virus, and this is the version of events that AQ preferred to take it with a pinch of salt, some thought for a while that the gibberish version was a ploy by mischievous, if knowledgeable pranksters in the US who wanted to disseminate a Trojan virus among jihadi forum visitors. It's a fine theory, but it was later revealed the real source of the dodgy version. Apparently, according to news sources like The Guardian, this was actually the Britishers doing. GCHQ, or the Government Communication Headquarters, is sort of a British version of the NSA, was behind the magazine not being released properly at the time. And that gibberish page, it was actually just a cupcake recipe turned into nonsense. And it goes without saying that if you managed to make one of those blow up, you followed Mary Berry's instructions very incorrectly. This actually sparked something of a rift between US and UK counterintelligence operations at the time. The UK were more focused on the threat of people having such information at all. They were only a few years out from the 7/7 London bombings, which killed a lot of innocent people at Al-Qaeda's hand. The threat they posed was still very fresh in British minds, so they wanted to stop such potentially devastating information from being disseminated at all. The US disagreed. They believed it was much better to allow the magazine to come out as is and use it against Al-Qaeda as an intelligence gathering tool. They could track who downloaded it, all whilst not playing their hand and showcasing counterintelligence strategies to their enemies. Now, both arguments have merits, but just like throughout history, the British were not asking for permission. They did it anyway. However, things didn't necessarily improve from Al-Qaeda's point of view when the magazine did eventually come out in its full form. Some have argued that the information Al-Qaeda was sharing about how to build a bomb was either wrong, not overly effective, or even dangerous. I mean, more dangerous than building a bomb already is. Now, that could be the result of smart counter-intel. Say, for example, that some intelligence agency downloaded Inspire and kept everything else the same, but changed the instructions on bomb making before redistributing it on jihadist forums so that an amateur would create a dud or blow themselves up in the process of trying to build a bomb. This would effectively fix the issue at source. Outside of having a deep understanding of building explosive devices, many amateurs wouldn't even realize the information they were receiving was wrong until it was too late. And if they already knew how to build one and were able to spot the information was incorrect, why did they need a manual on how to do it courtesy of Al-Qaeda? Not many people were reading Inspire for the advice column, let's put it that way. Okay, so there are the downsides from a security perspective, laid bare in publishing a magazine this brazen. But did the upsides, as far as Al-Qaeda saw them, come to pass in exchange? Well, believe it or not, there are a number of examples that we know of concerning people having copies of Inspire who went on to attempt lone wolf-style terror attacks in the West. The Boston bombers are the most famous example, but they're also an interesting case. The Zazania brothers caused the largest terror attack on US soil since 9/11 with their homemade pressure cooker bombs. The attack killed 3 people but injured around 500. US federal law enforcement officials apparently confirmed that both Tamerlan and Sarnev and his brother Jochacha got the instructions from reading Inspire. However, it's not quite so cut and dry. The Anti-Defamation League asserts that this isn't true, as the instructions they used to build the devices were not exclusive to the jihadist magazine. Their online activity indicated fascination with radical jihadist militancy consistent with the message of the magazine, but it wasn't the only propaganda and terrorism instructional media out there that the brothers were actively consuming by 2013. The brothers were mostly affiliated with having roots in the Russian regions of Chechnya and Dagestan, which, if you know anything about either of those places, aren't exactly strangers to homemade explosives. It could have been Inspire, sure, and some of the evidence points to an influence from the magazine, but it remains to be seen just how much influence it really had. It just as easily might not have been, and Al-Qaeda may simply have wanted to take the credit, because it didn't stop one of its issues that later came out praising the attack and encouraging more like it, quoting here, "Americans, you should understand this simple equation. As you kill, you will be killed. Yesterday it was Baghdad, today it is Boston. You should be asking, where is next?" So, where do we have direct evidence of Inspire directly causing terrorist attacks on Western soil? Well, for starters, in November 2012, Reyes Kasi reportedly admitted to having read the Inspire magazine after he and his brother were arrested for allegedly plotting a bomb attack in New York City. A search of his home turned up bomb-making components consistent with instructions that can be found in an issue of Inspire that it read. In November of 2011, Jose Pimentel was arrested and charged with state-level terrorism offenses in New York after he allegedly came close to completing 3 bombs based on an Inspire design. He also reposted PDF copies of the magazine to his own website. Meanwhile, former U.S. soldier Nasser Jason Abdo was arrested at a motel in Killeen, Texas, where authorities claimed that he was plotting to attack a restaurant frequented by military personnel based at Fort Hood. In the hotel, there were bomb-making components, as well as the first issue of Inspire, which infamously gave instructions on how to build one. And it's safe to say that these guys are now in jail forever, but very little harm appears to have actually come from people possessing the magazine and directly using it as a tool to commit terror attacks. The absolute threat of harm is clear, yes, but not necessarily widespread harm outright, not like the Boston bombers managed to do anyway. Academic articles aiming to analyze the cause and effect links of magazines like Inspire have found that whilst some of the strategies in these magazines do appear after publication, it's often only after a considerable amount of time has passed. This, at the very least, shows that such instructions don't fully resonate with readers in real time, and these strategies that are otherwise spread around jihadist circles could have come from any number of different places. Think about it like this. The general instructions of how to build similar devices in works like the Anarchist's Cookbook are out there, and of course plenty of harm over time, but lots of that information is widely disseminated enough in other places that you wouldn't attribute every instance of a homemade bombing to the publication of that book. It's a similar idea with Inspire. Influence? Undeniable. Jihadist results? That's a lot harder to prove, and there's not a lot of evidence of success. So overall, it's fair to say that Inspire did just that. It inspired many people by turning their head towards more radical ideas and means, but it's unlikely that it's done a significant amount more than that in reality, at least not in the global jihad way that Al-Qaeda were hoping for. And now let's talk about the magazine today. Well, it reflects in a lot of ways what Al-Qaeda is today. It's still around, but it's not as potent as it once was. After the deaths of Khan and al-Awlaki, who published 7 issues in 14 months, only a further 12 editions would ever be issued in the ensuing 14 years, with many having noted that the regularity and quality of the magazine both dropped without their American founders. And as far as we can tell, there's no directly public-facing figureheads behind it now other than a relatively shallow AQ media wing. A person by the name of Yahya Ibrahim is widely reported as the editor since the original duo's deaths, but there's no known information about him, and it's likely an alias for one or several people now producing the content. But Al-Qaeda's own strategies changed too, which might indicate another reason why Inspire has fallen off. The goal for Al-Qaeda is still global jihad, certainly, but Al-Qaeda increasingly found themselves being forced to operate within the practicalities of being a somewhat washed-up terror network. They prefer now to operate and influence countries within the Muslim world on a more regional basis, rather than directly attacking the United States and its allies. That's not a hard and fast rule, it's just a general trend that was likely born out of losing a lot of their leaders by the mid-2010s and losing territory over time to other radical jihadist groups like ISIS, or in AQ's case in Yemen, the Houthis. But it's not totally gone. Issue 18 came out in late 2023 to call for attacks on the US over their influence in the ongoing Gaza conflict. Issue 19, the most recent one to date, came out in February of 2024 and was published in a video format theologically justifying attacks against the US. But you never know. It's a terrorist organization. Anything could happen and change the whole game next week in terms of their strategy. We'll just have to wait and see. In a strange way, al-Awlaki and Khan kind of had a point. You can't kill an idea. Inspire still exists a decade and change after both men's deaths. Radical Islamic jihadists definitely still exist, and even radical jihadist publications encouraging terror attacks still exist. They're just supercharged by other groups. You only have to look at half the things ISIS were posting online at their height to prove that these kinds of ideas aren't going anywhere. ISIS even have their own magazine called Daqib. Inspire was never the only jihadist propaganda out there, and some might even have taken its formation as something entirely new at the time, but it really wasn't. It captured Western public and government attention, it scared some people, and it motivated others. At the end of the day, that's what propaganda does. Inspire gave an old idea a new coat of paint. Maybe. But was it entirely original? Absolutely not. Groups like Al-Qaeda want its enemies to be afraid of the media it produces. That's why they are called terrorists. But even in the face of such media, we have to choose to be brave and to not live in fear, because that is the only way to defeat poisonous ideologies for good. Thank you for watching.